Hello, welcome.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello, welcome.
Hello.
This session, it looks like only has 3 papers, so we're just going to give people an extra minute to get in
Sure.
since we'll have ample time. We're waiting on one more presenter.
Yep. I'm going to get my timer organized.
Okay. Yeah, so I think given again that this is a smaller session, if you want to take a little bit extra time, that's fine, because there'll be 3 papers.
Okay.
So don't feel like you absolutely have to stick to the 10 minutes.
That's always a dangerous thing to say to people at presenting a conference.
Yeah. People have been pretty good about it though so far.
Yeah, it's been excellent.
Yeah. Well, definitely make sure to pass along your feedback to Andy.
Sounds good. Did you see the
Yeah,
chat
I'll write to him after.
question and answer thing?
It should be at the bottom of your screen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for pointing that out, Jenna.
Yeah.
Let me see. Oh, okay, hold on. I will promote you. That's why. Hold on one sec. All right, Scott, let's see if that fixes it. Hold on. Oh, there you are. Can you see us? Now you should be able to click at the bottom of your screen. There you are. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, so it is 3 papers. Let's say like max 13 minutes. And then what I'll do, I hate interrupting people. So I'll keep my video up and then I'll just flag you 2, 1, 0 to give you a warning. So if you need up to 13 minutes for an extra 2, so we'll have still plenty of time again because there's only 3 papers. Is that okay to everybody?
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Sounds good. All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is CrimCon stream number 3. My name is Jordana Navarro. I am not Joan Atunes, who got pulled into a last-minute faculty meeting. So I'm going to be moderating this, but keep my interaction brief. All I wanted to mention is we're going to hold questions till the end, like a normal conference presentation. Feel free to use the chat box to send questions, or there's a question box that I'll be monitoring. But as the presenters finish, we're going to just keep moving to make sure we see everything, and then we'll have a Q&A. So with that, let's host our first paper, and I'll let our first speaker introduce himself.
Great, thank you. Let me just get my stuff up here. There we go. So my name is Ben Levin. I'm a retired academic in Toronto. You see my email there. And also you can find a lot of my work on ResearchGate under my name. Why is this not going? Oh, there we go. Let's start with this. It's quite a noise, but are we having any impact? Because of course the idea of research is that it matters to someone. We're doing this stuff because we want someone to pay attention to it. And so I'm wanting to talk about how research matters. how it gets taken up and used. A bit more about myself. I had a long career in education. I'm not a criminology or criminal justice person by background. I worked in the academy, and I spent many years working in government doing policy work on education. I had a career-long interest in the use of research evidence to shape policy and practice. I had my own encounter with the criminal justice system some years ago, which effectively ended my career. And in a typical researcher way, I started paying attention to the body of evidence on criminal justice. I was struck by how poorly evidence got used in criminal justice. It seems to me a field where there's quite a bit of consensus on many important issues, and yet that consensus doesn't get taken up in policy, unlike education, where there isn't that much consensus on most issues. So a lot of my experiences in Canada, but I think what I'm talking about applies more broadly and also beyond education, because I did a lot of work related to other fields like the use of evidence in healthcare and social policy generally. So this is the model that I developed with colleagues over time to think about the way research evidence gets taken up and used. And it's got these three interacting, what I call contexts. We need to think separately about the way evidence is produced, which is largely in universities, but some other places as well. I'll come back to that. And the places where evidence is taken up, which in criminal justice is largely the court system or the prison parole system. Those are very different kinds of contexts. And then the part that we often leave out is the mediating part. That is all those individuals and groups that have the explicit role or call it that. And all of that happens in a social context that also influences and has a lot of influence, particularly in criminal justice. So let's talk about production, the way research is produced. In almost every area of social policy, most research is produced by academics. NGOs play a role, but their role is more in other areas, which I'll talk about a bit later. Education is a bigger field, so it has more researchers and more research gets done, although it's not big when you compare it, say, to health, which is vastly bigger and which people tend to hold up as the model of how research to practice should work. Health is different in some other important ways. One thing that struck me looking at criminal justice that's different from other fields is that it's very split between law and social science. And there you have two very different ways of thinking, two very different ways of presenting work, different ways of considering what evidence is even. So that has an effect because the lawyers don't always talk to the criminologists and vice versa, although they sometimes do. There's a lot of other areas related to production in that last bullet that I really don't have time to talk about, but that are important in thinking about how all this works. So let's talk about use. Here's an aphorism that I really like about using research. When you mix politics and science, the result is politics. And that's to say that no amount of research evidence is going to trump political considerations. And I have a cartoon. I want to say something first before I come to the cartoon. So if we talk about the use of research evidence in these two fields, in criminal justice, the people who might use evidence can be divided into two rather different groups. The kind of blue collar unionized line workers who mostly inhabit, I would say, the prison system, the parole system, the probation system, all of that. And then the court system, which is staffed by mostly people who are powerful in that system anyway, are mostly university educated, more intellectual. So there's very different ways in which those two settings think about evidence. That's also different from education, which is basically staffed almost entirely by people who were teachers at one time and went through the process of training for teachers. However, in both these cultures, and indeed in every other culture that we've looked at, people value experience over evidence. Given a choice between what I know from my own experience or my colleagues, I'm going to pay more attention to that than I am to anything I read in any journal or anyone sends me in the way of evidence. And both these systems, in my view, have weak processes for mobilizing and using evidence. And by processes, I mean the way that the use of evidence is built into the way the organizations do their work. I think the courts in particular have a lot of difficulty in knowing what to do with social science evidence as a concept in law as well as in practice. So you end up with this. Let me interrupt your expertise with my confidence. In other words, expertise matters less than other things. Now, if we talk about mediation, the third context, this is generally done by third parties. There are a lot of those in criminal justice. There are a lot in education too, but there are a lot in criminal justice, but most of them are small and poorly resourced and often competing to do similar kinds of things and looking for money and resources to do those things. In education, there's a fair amount of government support in many countries for mobilization of research evidence. I think of the education labs in the United States or the Education Endowment Foundation in England, for example. I don't see that there's any equivalent in the criminal justice system where governments have set out to find processes to move solid evidence into practice and policy. And the mediation process is often very disorganized, I said, because you had a lot of different groups doing similar things and often competing to do them. Now let's talk about the context in which all this happens. Criminal justice is powerful because it's so emotional and therefore political. It gets used politically in a way that education doesn't, much more so. And you see this, for example, in the extent of media coverage around crime. Vastly disproportionate amount of media coverage in electronic media and print media and online has to do with crime. But most of that coverage has very little to do with evidence in the sense we're talking about it here about criminal justice. If you look at media stories, they're mostly interviewing victims, talking to neighbors, talking to the police. And a lot of those stories is about trying to create emotion in viewers and readers, because frankly, that's what brings eyeballs to pages. And that's what matters in the media world. So you get very distorted pictures. It's quite rare to find media coverage of criminal justice in which they actually interview or criminal justice. And what that means is there is more consensus on findings in criminal justice, as I mentioned. For example, there's a lot of consensus among criminal justice researchers that imprisonment is a poor strategy and we should use it less. But all the policy movement is in the direction of turning more things into crime and putting lots of people in jail and keeping there longer. And the reason, in my view, for that gap between what the evidence tells us and what we do has to do with political narratives. And I don't mean partisan political narratives there. I mean the way people think about the issues, people's gut reactions to crime, which are powerfully influential in the political world and trump evidence, as I said earlier. So this cartoon, I'm sorry, but you know too much. And that's the way we think about expertise, I think, to a considerable extent in criminal justice. We don't want to know. We have our ideas and we want to keep them despite the evidence. And that makes the take up of evidence difficult in a way that it isn't in education. So barriers to more use of evidence, coming to the end of this. We often talk about individual barriers, which I refer to as will and skill. That is, people don't know enough about evidence or they don't know how to use it. And so we need to do more training. I actually think that individual barriers are much less important, and I think the literature supports this, than organizational barriers. And by what I mean by that is what I referenced earlier, which is in most cases, we have very weak systems to build the use of evidence into practice in the way that it is done to a greater extent in healthcare, say, where you find this is institutionalized. It's not institutionalized in criminal justice. And if it's left out to individuals to choose to do it or not, they won't do it. That's especially the case where our ideas rest on emotion, because the more emotionally invested we are in idea, the more resistant we are to facts and to evidence about it. And you just got to look around at the response to COVID, for example, to see how true that is. So what might be done? Well, this is fine as far as it goes, but from here on, it's who you know. Well, that's not quite true. Here's a few suggestions. First of all, I think we need to strengthen the role of NGOs as mediation agents, and there's some very good examples. I think places like the Vera Institute or the Marshall Project in the US are really interesting examples of NGOs doing important work around criminal justice. We need to have better connections between the research community and the small p political community. So if we have, say, overrepresentation, as we do in Canada, of Indigenous people or Black people in jail, and those organizations, Indigenous and Black organizations, are involved in political movements around that, and will want to make use of research evidence, and those connections have to be built and fostered. I would say fewer new organizations and more alliances and synergy, because there are a lot of people trying to do similar work, and they could work together more effectively, I think, than they do. Creating institutional vehicles to mobilize evidence, which I've already talked about. You got to build this into the way people do their everyday work, the way they're trained, but also the way they are evaluated and rewarded. And when that happens, you start to see much more take up of evidence into practice and policy. And all of these strategies have to take into serious account the fact that standpoints on criminal justice are so deeply emotional, and the impact that has on the use of research, because it makes people resistant to facts that they don't like. So, just to finish, that looks like a very difficult task to take on, and it is a very difficult task to take on. I've been working on this for many, many years, and it's a one step, two steps forward, one step back kind of issue. But I like this visual because there we go. I like this visual because I think it represents the balance between what we'd like to do and what might actually be possible. You don't often see an elephant in a hang glider, but maybe we can make it happen. So with that, I'm going to finish and say thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers of this conference for doing a fantastic amount of work and making it so successful, and everyone who's participated. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. And on that note, yes, indeed, if you have any feedback on this conference, make sure you're in touch with Andy. Easy enough to find him on Twitter. With that, we will start our next paper.
All right, I believe that is me.
That is you.
Let's see here. Oops.
And while she's getting set up, please, again, if you have any questions for Ben, please utilize the chat box, and we'll swing back to those at the end.
Perfect. Well, thanks for having me. My name is Jenna Borseth. I'm from North Dakota State University, and I'll be presenting on a study that I did with Dr. Andrew Myer and Dr. Matthew Makarios on what happens when we try to implement some evidence into existing programming and some of the struggles that can arise from that. So instead of focusing specifically on the R&R model, which is what the program sort of adopted, I'd like to instead focus on the facility and what they did to adhere to this model, or some of the practices that they adopted in doing this. So for example, for the risk principle, they pulled in the LSIR, or the level of service inventory revised to assess risk. They track it in their programming, and then when offenders finish in the halfway house, they reassess that risk to see if any change has occurred. For the need principle, they identify those needs, again, based on the LSIR, to identify which criminogenic needs the offender has. And then they have case plans that they can create actionable and single tasked goals for these offenders to work on in order to sort of reduce those needs that they have. For responsivity, there's sort of two ways in which this can be addressed. So for general responsivity, the program just adopted some cognitive behavioral therapy based programming for offenders. And then for specific responsivity, they focused on assessing motivational stages of offenders that they can account for. And then they track things like if they have any cognitive disabilities or learning disabilities or mental health concerns that they can address with their case manager before being referred to some of these programs. And then the fidelity principle is sort of where me and my colleagues come in with assessing the program, determining whether or not they're successful in meeting some of their goals and in applying some of these principles of offender treatment. So we used a quasi-experimental matched case design. We had the experimental group being those halfway house clients, which we used a year's worth of clients. So we had a total of 503 people in the sample. And then the comparison group, we compared them to a group of probationary clients in the same area during the same time period. So we had a start of around 1,500 probation clients that were eligible matches for this group. And then we matched on a few variables. So we got exact matching for gender, race, risk level, referral offense. And then we did a fuzzy set match for age. So clients were able to match with anyone within a 3-year age range from them. So for example, if you were 27 years old, you could match with someone who was on the lower end, 24 years old, or up to 30 years old. And then our main dependent variable was recidivism, which we just defined as a new conviction within 2 years of discharge from the program. So the study sort of starts by just looking at recidivism. This isn't pictured, but we did start by just doing a chi-square analysis of recidivism, in which we found there was no significant difference between the treatment and comparison groups. And so that's why we decided to sort of break it down and look a little bit more closely at discharge status and risk level, specifically because successful clients we thought might have a higher chance of being successful than those unsuccessful clients, just since they've received the whole amount of treatment. But as you can see, there was no significant difference, even with those comparing those successful halfway house participants to probationary clients. And then we looked at risk because we thought, well, research indicates that halfway houses are a little bit more effective with those moderate and high risk clients. And so we thought that, again, we might see a better treatment effect amongst those groups rather than focusing on the low risk clients as well. But again, as you can see on the screen here, that there was no significant difference. So after this, we decided to look a little bit more closely at risk need and whether or not the program was adhering to these principles. Unfortunately, we weren't able to look at whether or not the LSIR was being implemented properly, but we do know it was being implemented because they keep track of the scores and they have all of those records within the facility. So instead of focusing on that component of risk, we decided to look at whether or not they're targeting those offenders they should be, and whether or not offenders are being given the right amount of dosage. So within this graph, you can already see that they do accept low risk clients into their facility. That makes up about 14% of their sample, which would not be recommended based on the risk principle. But we did do a chi-square analysis looking at treatment dosage as well. And there was actually no significant difference in the amount of treatment or treatment hours being given to low, moderate, or high risk clients. So they were all receiving around that 0 to 99 treatment hours, which is designed for that low risk group and is not very appropriate for moderate and high risk clients. Then for the need principle, we decided to focus on offender placement into treatment program because we know that targeting those criminogenic needs that are high for offenders is really important. And so we focused on 2 programs that the facility actually outlines referral criteria for. So for example, for the Thinking for the Change program, case managers should be referring clients if they are high risk and if they have 2 or more elevated criminal thinking areas. However, when you look at the chart here, you can see that around 1 in 3 clients are not being properly referred to that group. So they either have criteria and are not attending, or they don't have criteria and are attending. And similarly for the substance abuse group, we have about 2/3 of clients who are not being appropriately referred. So overall, our study really just goes to show that even when we know what's effective in an academic setting, um, again, these are principles that have been very well researched and have a lot of support behind them. Um, there's still a lot of nuance that goes into actually implementing them in a treatment setting. And so it also underscores that last principle of fidelity and really needing to assess programs, give them feedback, and reassess and continue that loop of offender treatment. So that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for letting me present and for hosting the conference.
Thank you. Again, another reminder, if you have any questions, please go ahead and send those along, and we will move on to our final paper.
Hi, I'm Scott Peterson. I'm 24th Global Youth Justice Training. Can everybody hear me there?
You cut out a little bit. Can you just reiterate that since we have time?
Sure. My name is Scott Peterson, and I am the CEO for Global Youth Justice. Some of you might know them. We have about 1,800 youth court, teen court, peer court, student court diversion programs. They're now in 48 different states. Although we've got a training going on here, and we've got adults from 17 states and 3 countries and 5 tribes. So there's about 100 other people watching. We have this on our screen, and we are at a training. These diversion programs, there's been several research studies we thought we would highlight. The first one I will mention was funded by the State Justice Institute. And the Maryland Administrative Other Courts evaluated these programs. In these programs, they're diversion programs. Arrest is not necessary. It can take place. They handle a lot of minor crimes like theft, underage possession of alcohol, marijuana, truancy, a lot of the alcohol, nicotine-related school incidents, a lot of the school to prison pipeline. And the good thing about them, why they replicated so much, is no one owns them. All of these youth court, teen court, peer court, student court, and peer jury names are public domain. So what we have taking place across the country, going all the way back to the first juvenile court in 1899 in Cook County, is we have this huge volunteer driven, really textbook local grassroots movement. The police can run them, probation can run them, courts run them, the district attorney's offices, nonprofits, schools. With us here today, we've got our Superior Court judge in California. We also have, that's Charles Irvin, our New Orleans juvenile family court judge is here, Judge Desiree Cook Calvin. And these are growing rapidly across the country. Hundreds more are in development. There only have been 3 research studies that have taken place. The first one was by the State Institute Justice, funded by them. The Maryland Administrative Other Courts administered it. In Maryland, they use the word teen court. It's just a name that they use. Some pick youth court. And again, these are diversion programs. Courts are only established by the Constitution or a state statute. And the recidivism came back pretty significant. And this was a 1-year post-adjudication. So they've been referred to the diversion program. They completed their peer and post-community service. And from that point forward, they did recidivism using a rearrest measure. Baltimore was 2.5 times less likely for youth who appeared in those programs as a young offender. Charles County was 6 times less likely. And the other one was Montgomery County, which was 4 times less likely. If you go on the Global Youth Justice website, everything is public domain. We're not an association or networking group, so we put everything on there, public domain. Hundreds of people have helped build it. But under the website, on the resource button, just click on research. So one research button, all these major studies are included on one easy link. We also have about 12 local links. The other research I wanted to mention, that was funded by the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, OJJDP. I actually worked there from 1997 to 2008. And this was funded by them. And that was to the Urban Institute. The two researchers on that were Dr. Jeffrey Butts and Dr. Janine Buck. That looked at recidivism for 6 months post-adjudication only. That program became kind of a little victim when the administrations changed and funding ended. I'm sure we kind of know how that takes place. But that also turned out really well. The Anchorage Youth Court was one the Urban Institute looked at. That was a youth-based model with the youth as judge, prosecutor, defender, clerk, bailiff. That had a 6% recidivism rate for juvenile offenders. The other one they looked at in Arizona was in Tempe, Arizona, and Maricopa County. And actually their deputy director of juvenile probation is here, Charles C. She's watching this. They run a lot of teen courts under there. That was 9% recidivism. Maryland, they looked at a teen court in Baltimore. That was 8%. And then one of the first youth court diversion programs in the country, Independence, Missouri. And that program resulted in a 9%. We also had a recent George Washington University compiled data. This was funded through the research department. That had 129,000 youth, 540,000 were referred to these programs, and 116,144 completed the program. So I think when you're looking at the numbers, and even when you're looking at research across the country, like NCJJ does, I don't know that we're accounting for all these diversion programs, even when we're talking about juvenile crime going down. The last one I'll mention, and that one's from, just got released 3 months ago. That was funded through that couple years there when NIJ got school safety money. RCT was done just on school-based models. Their school, community, juvenile justice, entirely local. They decide what they want to do. The one major funding for high school students was 47% reduction in bullying. The junior high school students, there wasn't a negative impact, but there was no impact on 7th and 8th graders in junior high. The impacts that were positive were just the high school students. And I'll just mention, again, we've got these all around the country. They're growing and spreading. If you want to visit our website, it's just globalyouthjustice.org. And again, everything on there is public domain. Everybody shares all information how to support people because they're just local. So yeah, I just thought I've been training for 3 days, so I seem kind of pepped up. It's because we haven't stopped, but I ran downstairs to do this right after I shoved some food in my mouth. So thank you for including us, CrimCon. I know we donated some money. It was pretty expensive to even do this with the amazing volunteers who organized it. So thank you for including us, and hi everybody upstairs on the floor above us.
Great, thank you. So that is our final paper. We'll pause for a minute to allow attendees to type questions.
Can we type questions?
There are no questions on deck, so if you have a question, for sure, go ahead and ask.
Yeah, well, I have a question for each. Jenna, do you know anything about how that program came to be in existence and why they chose that particular program? Like, did they get money for doing that? Was there some reason for that?
Dr. Myer, do you know about that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I got kiddos running around here. Help if I took this up. So it depends upon what you mean by program. Do you mean the actual halfway house, or do you mean
I mean within the halfway house, the program, the R&R approach that you were looking at?
Yeah. So the totality of the R&R approach was driven by their referral sources. So like most halfway houses, they're mostly getting their money from, state agencies. And so state agencies say, we want you to follow evidence-based practices. So the R&R approach comes driven from that. And so they get, special funding for risk tools. The programs they selected were based in research. So you're thinking for a change program is probably your most research CBT program that It comes out of NIC. And so it really was driven by a good faith attempt to adhere to the evidence of what's effective.
But at the practice level, maybe the incentives for the people working in the program to take that model seriously and try and implement it in a faithful way were relatively low.
Right. Yeah. It's one thing to have a risk tool. It's another thing to use it properly. It's another thing to make good decisions based on it. Right. It's one thing to say, it looks like this person's got a substance abuse problem, and then you send them to group. They don't do well in group. Well, then what do? Well, then we throw the kitchen sink at them. So the science seems pretty straightforward, but the implementation is a little bit more difficult for them. And I also feel we didn't have any measures for this, but I really do think there's a lot of outside pressure too. When you're funding source, them sending them, and you say, well, we're not supposed to take low risk people, right? Well, then you're throwing money down the drain is how some people look at it. So there's a lot of pressure on some of these groups that make it difficult for them to adhere to the research on what's effective.
And if I could, in a similar vein to Scott, what do you think are the main factors that lead places to adopt or use your program, or not to adopt or use it?
What do I think communities? Is that what your question? What they?
Yeah. What are the main factors that either result in people taking up your model or not deciding not to take it up?
Sure. These started about 35 years ago. So a lot of people just picked it up, and it grew locally. There's never been federal funding directly for it. When I worked there for about 10 years at DOJ, Shea Bilchek and John Wilson, they had hired me, and we did training in TA, we developed materials, they funded some research. But why these are growing so quickly and will more is they're volunteer driven. The youth who are volunteers, including former offenders, they volunteer as the judge, prosecutor, defender, clerk bailiff. And then there's a whole jury of more volunteer youth. So a young person who maybe was going to be arrested for marijuana, alcohol, all these different kinds of consequences, it doesn't let them off these diversion programs, and it doesn't put them into the system. Puts them kind of in the middle and says, if you finish this, go before your peers, and they give you 0 to 50 hours and maybe what other consequences, then we're not going to make a formal arrest. You're not going to get on probation. I think there's a cost effectiveness to it. You have a fuller part-time coordinator coordinating all those youth volunteers. Then there's a whole layer of adult volunteers who train the youth for the various roles. Another thing with the juvenile justice system, the number one sanction, if they do it at all, is mandated service. You have these young kids, what do you do with 10-year-olds to 18-year-olds? Well, in these diversion programs, they do a lot of the mandated service as groups, and more specific projects that are hopefully going to, have a positive impact. They scale, and it's hard to be another thing too. It's hard to shut these down if you're the mayor or the county executive. I've started one of the earliest programs, then did it federally. 2009, Judge Burnett and I created Global Youth Justice, and we as a LLC, and then we turned it into a nonprofit 2015, 2018, 501c3. But we're justifying, we had several big foundations reach out to us about wanting to do like $1 million fund a research project. We wouldn't do it. We'd contract out with some researchers. But one of the main things that they liked about it is the public policy aspect, and that it's affordable. The adults are still the ones who created these, behind it. The adults determine it can operate. Again, it's not a real court, but it's real diversion. And there's not that pettiness to somebody owning it or us making money off of the local programs. Anybody can do it, and we don't. It's bringing people together. It's that thing people talk about, and people can see it in the community. It's right in the courtrooms too. It's when they're not being used, and we already paid for them as taxpayer dollars. It's a safe place, hopefully public accessible. It's not one of these $1 million programs, more like 50 grand. So just giving kids a second chance, and you learn the other kids too, researchers, the civic side, the education, the democracy. These kids volunteer for a year to help their peers. And I ran one for like 3 years, like 25 years ago, and I'm hooked. I've been hooked on them since, like a lot of people. Yeah. Anyways, yeah. They got me all pumped up from the training.
We do have an additional question that came in, but I just wanted to make sure. Did you have any other questions, Ben, before we? Okay. For
Good for-
Scott, do any of these programs give specific attention to youth with disabilities since they tend to be vastly overrepresented in the school to prison pipeline involvement?
Yeah, there's 10 of our associations got together and they worked on a program to reach out to the youth out of the mainstream. And what they did is they reached out to all the former offenders who've gone through these diversion programs. They reached out to youth disability groups, LGBTQ youth, and they're trying to target, youth out of the mainstream to get involved because it's not some, a lot of the kids who aren't only disabled, but even other ones who have to work the whole time. It's something you can just do a couple days a month. And again, the courtrooms make it really accessible for public transportation by having them there. I think most programs, especially for youth who are disabled and have different challenges, often, there's not transportation available for them. But we find in these programs, they can get to the buildings easier. But universally, no, it just, again, depends on who's running them. But if I had to say, is there a specific national effort around targeting those kids? No, just because I know so many local programs. I know a lot of kids, we're in the school and you're dealing with the special needs kids. So a lot of them get referred, if you're talking about physical disability, if you're looking at the, mental health, all those kinds of issues, those youth already end up in these programs a lot for behavior problems. And what, again, this does, it diverts them from the system. So I guess we're helping them more on that end and involving them more as volunteers. So we could do a better job doing that,
Are there any additional questions? All right. Seeing none, thank you to everybody who's attended. Again, please do send feedback to the CrimCon folks. If you need their contact information, you can stick around. I can send that to you. But that's it for our session. Have a great weekend. Have a great holiday. Stay safe, everybody.
Have a good day.
Bye.